So when I get people who show up at my meetings and scream at me about eliminating parking, and this is the stupidest thing you've ever said, I couldn't think you could get any dumber, Mr. Bowders, but like, you are dumber than you were yesterday. I'm just like, I literally respond with feelings, which is, you seem really upset. You seem really upset about not being able to park in front of the store you visit once a month based on what you just told me. I'm really upset when people's children don't come home alive from school. I'm really upset that there are mothers who tell me that they would bike to work, but don't because the infrastructure isn't safe. So my feeling is that the safety of everybody is a little more important than the convenience of you. Those are my feelings. You have to reframe it away from all the facts because people do emote on this. They are like emotionally engaged on parking and on cars. And you have to actually just go to the space that wins, which is always safety.
Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome to Reinventing Parking. I'm your host, Paul Barter. This episode comes from the recent Abundant Housing Advocacy Conference, YIMBYtown 2022, in Portland, Oregon, which was hosted by the Sightline Institute think tank and local pro-housing group, Portland Neighbours Welcome. YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard, referring to supportive housing development within existing urban areas. We've heard about the connections between infill housing and parking in many Reinventing Parking episodes, and parking policy featured several times at YIMBYtown. For example, the Parking Reform Network hosted a well-attended happy hour event. There was also a lightning slides session, 20 Reasons to Hate Parking Mandates. This was a 20 slides in 8 minutes, delivered by Sightline's Catie Gould and Michael Anderson, and was followed by a group discussion led by Parking Reform Network President Tony Jordan. But this episode of Reinventing Parking is from another parking event at YIMBYtown, which was a lively and fascinating panel discussion with the slightly unexciting title, Parking Reform from Theory to Practice. The panel was moderated by Catie Gould of the Sightline Institute, as mentioned before, who we also heard from in our March Reinventing Parking episode. Today's episode will be a collection of highlights from that YIMBYtown panel. To begin, here is Catie Gould, the moderator, introducing herself and then introducing the members of the panel.
My name is Catie Gould. I'm a transportation researcher for Sightline, and I write a lot about parking lots and off-street parking minimums. Like a lot of the people at this table, parking was something that kind of found me on accident while I was trying to do other things. You can't really get away from it because it's involved in everything. My background is in active transportation advocacy. I co-chaired grassroots bike advocacy group Bike Loud PDX here for a number of years, and I was on the bicycle advisory committee for the city of Portland. And I have lived in Portland for 10 years now, and I have a car, and I park on the street for free. They've never asked to take my money. And I want to kind of start with a little story. When I first moved to Portland years ago, I was living a few blocks away from Division Street. Division Street's a little bit infamous. There were a number of apartment buildings that went up in a short time period that did not have any parking. And there was a big backlash against it in the neighborhood, and they reversed the policy, and then they reversed the policy again, kind of close back to the original. That was kind of the first time that I really remember something about city planning that I read in the newspaper. But that whole scuffle, I still talk to people today from around the country that when I'm oh, what's going on in parking in your city? And they're well, nothing like Division Street. And for people like us, the strategies of how to use less land devoted to cars and how to manage parking more effectively are pretty straightforward. But the politics is where it gets really jumbled up and messy and is a really hard fight. So that's what we are going to be talking about today. And we have a really star-studded panel today of people who have had these fights and come out successfully on the other end. So I'm going to just introduce our panelists. Next to me is Martha Roskowski. Martha brings together people to develop and implement strategies for sustainable and equitable mobility. At her consultancy for their strategies, she's worked on parking reform, congestion pricing, greenhouse gas budgets, zero-emission freight, and increasing funding for advocacy work. She has a very long resume of active transportation work that we're not going to get into, but she's been referred to as the godmother of complete streets. And relevant to our conversation today, she recently interviewed 40 parking experts and wrote up what she learned from them in this report that you can read online, Ideas to Accelerate Parking Reform in the United States. Next is Tony Jordan. He's the president of the Parking Reform Network. You might have bumped into him at happy hour last night and you're like still confused why you're here today. The Parking Reform Network is a nonprofit organization with a mission to educate the public about the impact of parking policy on climate change, housing affordability, equity, and traffic safety. His advocacy work as a founder of Portlanders for Parking Reform has helped modernize the city's curb management policies and repeal residential parking mandates here in Portland. Then we have John Botters. He's most well known as the mayor of Emeryville, California. He also serves as the chair of the Alameda County Transportation Commission and the vice chair of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. He is an incredibly outspoken advocate on sustainable land use policy, focused on dense urban design that incorporates active transportation and environmental policy to create people-oriented cities like Emeryville. And under his leadership, Emeryville has repealed parking minimums and installed its first paid parking meters. And then last on the end is Leah Boho. Leah advises property owners and developers through the development process. Before she entered the private sector in land use consulting, she worked for 2 Austin City Council members, most recently as a policy director for land use and transportation, where she worked on parking policies, including creating the street patio program, removing parking minimums from the central business district of Austin, and working on Austin's first parking benefits district, which she wrote a chapter about in Donald Shoup's new book, 2018, Parking in the City. So please give a big round of applause to have our panelists with us.
Let's get to business now with a short segment in which Catie asked the panelists to get back to some basics. What is parking reform? You will hear Catie ask the question, then brief answers from Tony Jordan, Martha Roskowski, and finally John Bouters.
Okay, there's a lot of different aspects about like what is parking reform. There's a lot of different things that people mean, right? Whether eliminating off-street parking minimums or unbundling parking from rents or pricing parking, on-street parking. I don't know if we have some specific stories about those.
Yeah, I mean, the most common thing is removing your parking requirements. I've said last night to a bunch of people, like, it's not a thing that's going to solve all your problems, parking reform, like specifically, but it's an anchor on almost any solution for the problems that we face city-wise or climate-wise.
Yeah, and I'd say if you're thinking about it kind of structurally, roughly 2 big camps of it. One is the zoning codes, the development. How much parking are we requiring new housing to build? Are we requiring existing buildings to have? And then off-street parking, I think of it. And then there's on-street parking, how we manage it. Do we price it? Do we, do permits? Can we remove it to use the street, that existing curb space, curb to curb for better uses like transit, like bike lanes? And they often live in really different parts of the city, different departments. So coming up with sort of a overall comprehensive sane parking strategy is sometimes really, there's a lot of barriers. Cities are often really balkanized and don't want to think about it comprehensively.
Yeah, I would pick up where Martha was. I would say that it's a suite of policies, right? And it's both the on-street and the off-street, and it's creating a comprehensive plan with a philosophy that is, in our case, is like people-oriented community spaces, right? And so then it's all the things that have been mentioned, from minimums to maximums to curb management, cost, to the externalized cost to the public and not having, meters in place or paid use of the space, to how do we incentivize unbundling parking so that we can minimize the amount of cost in the private development of spaces for housing and alternatives. So I think you have to kind of have a philosophy, and for us, it's like people first, right, is the goal. So to your comment about what are we building for, housing or for cars, right, I think that's exactly right.
Catie then asked the panel to focus on the benefits of parking reform. This time you'll hear from Leah Boho after Catie asks her question, then Martha, then Tony.
I don't know if parking is a really tense topic. I feel a little anxious just knowing that we're going to talk about it for the next hour. And the narrative around parking reform and changes to parking are often framed in like this loss aversion, like we're going to lose 10 parking spaces or we're going to lose free parking. And I kind of wanted to ground ourselves for a minute in hearing like, what are the benefits of parking reform? What are the good things that we're hoping that we're going to build?
So this is actually something Catie and I talked about the other day, and I think it's a really great way to reframe the conversation, which is what we gain when we get rid of free and abundant parking is we gain more equitable cities, we gain things being closer together, we gain opportunities to put active uses in places, we gain safer streets, and we gain the ability to get around in methods other than cars more safely and more comfortably. So I think we really should think more about celebrating the things that we gain and maybe countering that reaction people have when you talk about taking away parking or charging for it by talking about those benefits, because I think there are many.
Yeah, I think one of the most effective conversations today is around housing. That we can build more bedrooms, or we can build, we can devote storage space for cars. So I keep trying to bring it back to that conversation, rather than density, which people are scared of, at least in my community, but housing seems like a sweet spot to talk about.
I agree with all of the lost opportunities that you get when you build parking, and so the things that you get when you don't build it. I also think that parking reform as active advocacy area is you gain bringing together people from different aspects of climate, as our mission said, climate, housing, transportation. It's a great coalition builder that builds activist communities.
I agree.
This focus on the positive also infused the next segment, in which Catie asked the panelists to reflect on parking reform advocacy tactics, coalition building, and getting political support for change. You'll hear Tony first, then Leah, and then a crowd-pleasing input from Mayor John.
In Portland, when I first started going to the Planning Commission meetings, actually was what Catie mentioned about Division Street was when I kind of got involved here. It's intimidating going to speak at first, but it wasn't as scary if you just started with telling people how much parking cost. I went to some neighborhood meetings and people were very skeptical of what I was going to say, but when you ask them, do you know how much a parking space costs in a house? I mean, now it's becoming more commonly to understand that it's tens of thousands of dollars, and that adds hundreds of dollars a month to the rent. Talking about the space and the opportunity and the cars it brings. So I found that just starting out and being very blunt about the impacts to the community that parking brings, it doesn't always turn someone into a shoepista. And not everyone is arguing in good faith. But if you are someone who's arguing in good faith and you understand how much that costs and you accept it as a reality, it's a lot harder to oppose your reforms. And then you can apply basic organizing techniques to bring those people who, are a little bit more on your side to speak plainly or to write in about it. Planners and city councilors getting emails saying remove parking requirements from people that they don't aren't just the usual suspects was a shock, and I think had punched above its weight. Each letter was kind of worth several letters in opposition because it was kind of a novel thing for them to be getting.
I would add to that when I worked on the parking benefit district in Austin, our council office came into it when it was already moving and already going badly. And so we were coming in to try to kind of get it back on track. And so we came into a lot of negative feelings and a lot of people feeling like their street parking was being taken from them and was going to be overloaded. One thing that was fantastic is there were just a handful of people. We met people through that experience that we didn't even know were out there, who showed up of their own on their own to talk about how they, for example, bought an apartment downtown that didn't have a parking space and they don't drive, and it was so great because it was so much less expensive than all the other apartments in the building that had parking spaces. And so we had these little anecdotes, and I've heard a lot about it at this conference, about telling these stories and how much more compelling that is. And that's exactly how it was for us, is people showing up and saying, I don't have a car, I don't want to bring a car, I live in a place and I don't have a car. Those stories really help. At least the folks that were advocating against the parking reform could see that there were real people that didn't need a car, even if they couldn't imagine their own life that way.
I wrote down here the primary takeaway for me is facts versus feelings. And everybody was saying it with different words. It's facts versus feelings. You can give people the facts on parking, all the things that are bad about it, the cost of it, the externalizations of it, the space it takes up that could be other uses. And people don't give a F about the facts because it's their feelings. The vehicle is become an extension of them. They make this huge investment in that car. $700,000 over the lifespan of a person for a small vehicle, between the cost of owning it, paying for its maintenance, paying the payments on it, the gas, the insurance, when you hit the pothole, all those things, the parking. People have invested in something. And so it's this primal thing that they have to have, and it's a feeling. It's no longer fact-based. Parking, as a decision maker who sits in a transportation commission as the only cyclist, I sit with all the people who are drivers. And they are given all the facts. And I tell people all the time, advocates come and say, well, what do you do or what do you recommend? I say, here's the thing. If you come with climate change, it's dead on arrival. 88% of Americans understand and or believe that climate change is either completely or a majority of it is caused by human conduct. 88% of Americans have moved to a place of understanding that. Okay? Less than a third of them agree or believe that giving up their personal vehicle will help save the planet. There's a total disconnect between facts. So if you come with the narrative of this is a climate change thing, people externalize that because they don't feel personally responsible for addressing climate change. Why should that be my problem to solve? The government should be fixing that. Why should I in my town have to give up parking for this like totally abstract idea of like some reduction in GHG emissions to save the planet? So you have to actually speak to them in their language, which is feelings to feelings. So I use different feelings. I don't even use facts when I talk to other people. I don't. I mean, I know all the facts, and they know the facts, to your point. They all know it's true. They cognitively recognize it. But it's going to still come out as, I'm going to vote this other way because there's a lot of angry people in the room. So when I get people who show up at my meetings and scream at me about eliminating parking, and this is the stupidest thing you've ever said, I couldn't think you could get any dumber, Mr. Bowders, but like, you are dumber than you were yesterday, and you think that this is going to be good, and nobody bikes on San Pablo, and so your idea of bike lanes and this whole thing, like, this is crazy, and you're just inventing shit as you go, right? I'm just like, I literally respond with feelings, which is, you seem really upset. You seem really upset about not being able to park in front of the store you visit once a month based on what you just told me. I'm really upset when people's children don't come home alive from school. I'm really upset that there are mothers who tell me that they would bike to work, but don't because the infrastructure isn't safe. And when I look at the choices we've made, we've chosen to allow you to park your box once a month in front of a store so it's convenient for you. So my feeling is that the safety of everybody is a little more important than the convenience of you. Those are my feelings. You have to reframe it away from all the facts because people do emote on this. They are like emotionally engaged on parking and on cars. And you have to actually just go to the space that wins, which is always safety. Parking on streets actually undermines safety. So when I'm proposing to eliminate parking, like I do all the time, very successfully to the chagrin of many NIMBY people, I am very calmly telling them this is about the safety of every person in this community. And if you have a problem with me doing that, you should reflect upon why you have that problem. Because I don't have a problem. I ran on a platform of I'm going to make this a livable, safe community. And that's exactly what I'm doing with this policy. That's the end of the discussion.
Great. Well, I think we're all wrapped up here.
Got me in a council mood.
Next, Catie asked the panel to zero in on a key issue that connects parking with the push for more abundant housing in accessible places. After Catie's question, you will hear from Leah, then Tony, and then Martha.
I feel like it's like a very uniting value that nobody wants more cars on their block. Like everybody would prefer like the same or less. I'm curious on like how can we talk about parking and parking management, especially when we are wanting more neighbors in our neighborhood, but without the car traffic. Leah, maybe this is something the Benefits District might have gone into.
Yes, we did talk about that in the Parking Benefit District conversation, particularly in the neighborhood west of the University of Texas where this PBD was put in place. The streets were jammed, like absolutely like a disaster, like parked around corners, parked hanging out, in front of driveways, in front of fire hydrants, like everything. In that situation, the good news was no one could say that the unmanaged parking was going well. It was a safety disaster. And so we kind of had that to agree on. I think where it took convincing was that the management was going to work, like that there was actually it could be fixed and cleaned up and be orderly and safe. And then I think another thing that was actually helpful about that kind of, Jeff Tumlin calls it lizard brain reaction that people have. One of the emotional places people go to is like all they can think of is that one time they were late, they were in their car, they couldn't find a parking space anywhere, and so they're driving around getting later and later, and it's very stressful. And so one other thing that was helpful was showing people that like if we actually manage it properly and charge for it, there would be a space. You'll have to pay for it. But, the idea between managing street parking is that it should be priced so there's a space available on each block. So you won't be in that situation again where you have this car with you and you don't have anywhere to put it and you can't put it wherever you want, So I think that kind of helped also with that emotion. As far as the housing goes, it was a little bit of a different conversation there. I think there are other places in Austin where we've talked about, like with ADUs, for example.
ADU stands for Accessory Dwelling Unit, which means a small additional dwelling added to a property that has an existing home on the lot.
When we passed ADU legislation, we didn't make people park their ADUs, and there was a lot of feelings about that. But what we also were able to point out is that the minimum unit size is smaller than the minimum parking space size. So we're actually requiring people to set aside a bigger space in an urban environment for the parking space than for the unit. And that piece, it is a fact, but it did sort of, I think it kind of helped people click into like what the real choices were that we were making. And I think it actually helped a lot, especially people who had experiences trying to fit an ADU on their lot, on their single family lot. And they know that, if you have a tree and you have a slope anywhere, it becomes really tight. And so all of a sudden that parking space was actually competing against a habitable space. And
when you said people don't want more cars on their street, I mean, they also don't want more cars in their street. And I think that, Professor Shoup says, parking is a fertility drug for cars. More parking you build means more cars are going to be on the street. And we also know that just building parking doesn't mean people are going to use it to park a car in it. So like if you require the apartment building to build a bunch of parking spaces, if it's unbundled, people probably aren't going to want to rent it. And even if it's not unbundled, it might be inconvenient for them to park in there. Like people park on the street rather than their driveway all the time. If you build a parking space, you're inviting a car, and in many cases, like depending on a car, if it's a commercial parking space, depending on a car coming into that community every day and parking and leaving and clogging up the street, adding traffic, endangering your children, etc.
Yeah, so I live in Boulder, Colorado. We have like one of the worst ADU ordinances in the country because they pass something, but they really don't want people to build ADUs. One of the requirements is if you want to build it over a certain size, you have to add another parking space on your property, even though like my house, I live in a single family house because it's Colorado with a really long driveway, but that doesn't count as parking. I would have to like take out the tree or my garden in the front yard. And City of Boulder staff in their wisdom, anybody from City of Boulder planning staff? Just checking, has used parking as a lever. They don't really want more parking, but they know that people who build ADUs don't want to build more parking, so they use the parking requirements basically as ransom so that you would commit to making your ADU permanently affordable. Or developers come in, want to build less parking. In Boulder, they always want to build less parking than they are required to just because our minimums are so high. I used to work for the city. And they will grant the parking reductions, but they'll get other stuff for it. Like, well, we don't want to reduce our parking minimums because they want the parking reductions so we can make them buy eco passes. We can make them buy all this other stuff. So parking gets used in really weird ways, and I would say inappropriate ways. So start calling your cities out if they're doing that kind of stuff, because we're just ending up with more parking than we need across the board. I will say in Boulder, climate, our hearts go pitter-pat for climate. Our city council has declared a climate emergency. Yeah. So I belong to a group called Better Boulder, which is like the housing people. It's the co-op, the kids trying to get co-ops and the bike advocates, and also the developers. We want more housing. We want abundant housing in Boulder. So one of our thoughts is like, okay, if it's a climate emergency, why don't you guys just lop 25% off the parking minimums overnight? Let's just do that, in response to the emergency, because they say they're doing planning. And, in Boulder, like planning is the thing that, just is the excuse for doing nothing for a really, really long time. So I don't know how that will go over. Maybe our more progressive council majority will take that on and actually just reduce the minimums. We would like to get rid of them altogether, put in maximums, have it not just for new development, but also for existing development. I mean, Christ, Walmart. Okay, I talked to Walmart. The head of real estate for Walmart, they are reducing their parking lot sizes based on demand because they're all about the dollar And every bit of extra real estate they have out there that they have to paint, they have to sweep, they have to light, costs them money. The head of Walmart real estate told me that only like in 4 places in his, 30 years of developing property have the city requirements actually required them to build less parking than they wanted to. So like our cities are way out of whack with even, Walmart. So.
The segment just now got some interesting follow-up in the question and answer session. Here you will hear the question, then Leah's answer, then Martha, Tony, and John, all with short answers.
My question is about single-family neighborhoods, where in my experience, there's not a shortage of street parking. And the reason people want parking minimums is because they don't want anybody else's car parked in front of their house. Although even there, it's often presented as if it's a parking shortage. How do you deal with these single-family neighborhoods where the issue is keeping the space in front of my house empty rather than there isn't enough parking?
I'll take this one. Honestly, I think the way to deal with that is to make that an administrative process and not a discretionary one where council and other politicians have to weigh in on it. Because I think that the reality is that a public right-of-way is exactly that, and folks just don't have the right to own the street in front of their home. I've worked on similar things and I've never been able to be successful in it other than to give that duty to city staff and let them administer, whether it's residential permit parking or whatever else, charge the right price for it, manage it properly, and keep it out of the political realm, because I think the politics of it are really difficult. So I think there's a lot of things like that we would do better to take them out of politics and put them in administrative. It's a safety issue. It's under the city engineer's purview. We just need to keep it there.
Yeah, I do think Austin has done some really good work around parking removal, like for bike lanes. Again, it's an administrative process. They have a whole process that they go through, so it doesn't get, as political as quickly.
I want to briefly point out that in Portland, when we got rid of our single-family residential parking as part of RIP, the housing drove that change. The parking kind of is slipstreamed in behind because the realization is you can't build middle housing and have parking requirement. I think that's what's going to push it is the YIMBY housing advocacy. The housing conversation is going to make that happen because you just can't build fourplexes or triplexes and add parking for every house. It doesn't work.
I want to agree about making it an administrative function, but I also just want to give one little quip about one experience. So when we put our paid parking program in place, we have one neighborhood, nothing is single family zoned in our city anymore. And we had people who raised that question that was just asked, like, oh my God, all the people who don't want to park over by the businesses and pay the meters are going to park in front of our houses. And there's already not enough spaces for parking, whatever. So if you do have to do the public process as opposed to the administrative process, I highly encourage a town hall. Fabulous. I highly encourage a town hall because in it, I had one guy who came up to the microphone. He's like, I parked 7 cars on the street and I was just like, and everyone's looking at him and I was like, oh, they're all going to figure out that they are the problem. I was like, oh, and I had one lady, she's like, well, the car in front of my house has been there for 3 years and it hasn't moved. So at the end of the meeting, I was like, so this is the phone number to report a car that hasn't moved in over 2 weeks. And we towed all the cars out of the neighborhood that were just abandoned in the neighborhood. And the people were like, oh, there's a lot of parking.
Catie asked Mayor John about his city's parking maximums. After John, you will hear from Martha and then Tony Jordan.
In Emeryville, you do have some leverage. Your parking maximums are a bit lower than other cities. Maybe we can talk just a minute about what that's like in development.
Is it the end of the world? Did
No.
commerce stop?
No, it grew. Yeah, I laugh whenever I hear climate emergencies because, like, when you have an emergency, you take immediate action. So when the neighboring cities around us are like, we're declaring a climate emergency, I'm like, we'll just keep doing policies. Thanks. Yeah, in Emeryville, we eliminated parking minimums, and we put in a paid parking program for the city streets, and we reduced parking maximums. And then we did other fun things that already existed, but we were actually using them where they hadn't been used consistently in the past. So we have transit overlays for transit hubs where we play really fun math, where we like blow parking minimums or maximums like to oblivion. So like you're already like have this reduced minimum or maximum, And then you're in the purple circle on the map. I love the purple circle. And when you're in the purple circle, it's like you can only get half of whatever you had to begin with. And so we get folks who are like, well, this is like a really small amount of parking. We're like, yeah. Yeah. And so what we do is we wield the tool for good, right? A lot of people, like you were saying, play funny games with parking and they try to extract other things. For us, we use it to actually deal with other parking. We'll get like a developer who will come. We have one coming right now who's like, hey, I have this giant lab research building. I want to build all kinds of new jobs and new revenue for the city, but I'm in the purple circle. And I'm like, yeah, you're across the street from a train station. And he's like, well, I can only build this many stories to my parking garage because of that. And I can't get financing for my building. I'm like, well, what's the threshold you need to reach? And it's like, they need an extra story to their parking structure. I'm like, okay. Get rid of all the parking on all the city streets in the 9-block area of your PUD, turn it all into separated bike lanes, and we have a deal. And they're going to do it. Because they want their building. And I'm like, I want all the cars off the street then. So you have your parking structure, and that's where they should go. Because what happens is people build parking garages, and to the point you made earlier, the people still park on the street. So like you take aerial videos of our city, and like the tops of all these parking structures are all empty. And so when people are like, oh, the city's got no parking, I'm like hell it does. Look at Google Maps. Like seriously, like it's completely not being utilized. And so if we're going to actually give you the parking you say you need, well, then I would like to have the public right-of-way back so other people can use it properly, because that's what it's for. So
yeah. In Boulder, we called it the oil stain test. Like, go up on the very top floor of your parking garages and see how many cars actually sat there. You don't even need an official count. It's like...
On the parking maximums topic, it is interesting because Parking Reform Network took this map that you might have known from Strong Towns. We researched like all the records that were actually on there and made it a lot better. You can check it out on our website. It had a thing for parking maximums. And when we were researching, I realized a lot of cities have parking maximums and they're completely irrelevant and ineffective. Like, we stopped even recording them because they weren't worth recording. Minimums are often attacked because they're arbitrary limits. You don't know how much parking is supposed to be at a place, right? And maximums can, on the other side, I think, be attacked for the same logical fallacy. I don't think that it's bad to try and restrict the parking. I think particularly you're talking this purple circle area. Like, if it's part of a plan, like I think like cities, if you have a climate action plan or a transportation plan, parking brings cars. If you have a plan to have less cars, then you should have a plan to have less parking, and it should be based. That's a logical thing you can tether it to that is real, not just, 3 spaces per house. Why not, Or it used to be our minimums, and now it's our maximum. And I also think that the pretextual zoning, this idea that, you're going to hold things ransom, it should be flipped. Like, why do you make someone who doesn't build parking buy a bus pass when we know that not building parking is like the best transportation demand management that exists? That's going to make people take the bus. So I think outside of these plan areas, or even in them, I would suggest like we should be pushing for impact fees. If you want to build parking, you don't have to build any, but if you want to build it, you have to pay some money so we can use it to pay for bus lanes or bike lanes or bus passes.
John Bouter's answer just now mentioned the issue of lenders demanding plentiful parking as a condition for lending to real estate developments. One of the questions in the question and answer session followed up on that issue. I just want to share Leah Boho's answer here.
So I represent developers and entitlements in Austin, and so we come up against this a lot. And one thing that I think happens frequently is it's not that they necessarily have a number in their head. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they also just want to know what the other office buildings, for example, that are delivering in the second quarter of next year are, or what their ratios are, so that they can be close, competitive. So it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but that's what they want to know. So I do think that each building that we can chisel away, and sometimes, there's certain folks that are, maybe they're self-funding, so they can do whatever they want. And so if we can get that median number to keep coming down for comps, basically, I think that's the way for at least now. And that's not a really exciting answer because it's not fast, but it is the path that I see given our current sort of lending and current sort of way that those big buildings get funded.
The next highlight from our panel is an important segment tackling the issue of equity and the implications of parking reforms for equity. You will hear Leah, then Martha, Tony, John, and then Martha again.
So I think that the beginning of this conversation has to start with the fact that if we're not charging for parking separately, if we're not charging people at the street or to pay in a garage, then they're all having that cost wrapped into everything else that they buy, whether it's housing or groceries. People are paying for parking. And I think the reason we feel bad about charging somebody to pay, say, at a meter is because we've built cities where people really have to drive. A lot of people have to drive in a lot of cities. If we put housing where people need it to be and where people want it to be and provide them alternatives to get there, like buses or walking or biking or whatever, we wouldn't feel so bad about charging someone for parking on a car-by-car basis. So I think we've sort of created this problem where where we feel like it's inequitable to charge for parking.
So what I am seeing, I've been doing transportation work for a long time, and as concerns about equity, environmental justice have come more to the forefront, I think a lot of our progressive leaders really they care about it. They want to do the right thing. What I see is the equity card gets played. Like, I worked on congestion pricing. I saw that get played. It won't be fair to poor people, both by people who were truly concerned about what are the impacts on those folks who have been pushed out to cheaper housing way on the outskirts and honestly have no alternatives but to drive to their jobs. It was also played by people who just didn't like the idea. They didn't want to have to pay to drive, and it was convenient to say, this won't be fair to poor people. So I think when that card gets played, you all have to sit down and really have the conversation about it. If we truly cared about the impacts of pricing parking on poor people, we have mechanisms to address that. We have food stamp eligibility. We have various things. You could just say, these people pay less to park because we understand those impacts. We don't do that across most of our society. Everybody pays gas tax. Sales taxes are incredibly regressive. We don't do that. The reality is, about 30% of our population does not drive cars. Mm-hmm. That is age, that's ability, that's income. There's a huge swath of our population that they don't drive. And so all of the parking, all of this land that we devote to parking is inherently inequitable to them. So I don't mean to be flippant about equity. I am truly concerned about it, but I also don't like it when it just gets tossed up as the reason to not do things.
I agree with the previous answers, and I also think there's two aspects to this. One is access, and they've been touched on. Access, like access to spaces. Do we have equitable access? And one thing is we have a lot of parking. So the good news is we have a lot of parking that's never going away. So if you're really concerned about people with disabilities or people with children being able to park, reserve all the parking spaces for people with disabilities or with children, and they'll always be able to park exactly where they want to go. Access for people who don't have access to cars, and we know that the solution is not to build more parking for them. It's to increase transit and make other modes safer. The second part is the money. Is it regressive? And I think that there's two things I think of and really push on here is, one, how you spend the money. And Shoop talks a lot about this with benefit districts, but you can spend the money in incredibly progressive ways, and you should. You should not spend parking money to build more parking ever, and you probably should never spend parking money to just fund your general transportation operations, because then when you have a crisis and you don't have it anymore, you have to lay people off and you have a big problem, and then you decide to just raise the price of parking for no reason, which doesn't really work because of economics. But
it's not specific at all.
The other thing is that I really, and this is where a little more radical, but this can be a redistributive thing. We know more people who pay for parking are wealthier. They have cars and they go places to spend money that, you're going usually to spend money somewhere. So usually we come up with programs like discounts or, we give people transit passes, and that's great. But honestly, we should just give cash to people with low incomes. If you're concerned, if the person arguing against you's concern is low income people can't pay this, well, then we should be advocating for a universal or at least a low income basic transportation benefit. And then people who are low income can spend that money on parking, or they can spend it on childcare, or they can spend it on whatever. And they'll say, I hear this from planners all the time. Well, we don't know. We can't justify this because we don't know if they'll spend it on transportation. And I'm like, well, did they get where they were going? Then they spend it on transportation. If you need a sandwich so you have the energy to walk down the street, you spent that on transportation. And so I think you can access and money, and there's very good solutions to both of them, and neither of them requires building a bunch of parking.
High five.
Yeah, so I was over here. I was like, I think I got a bingo. I got a bingo. I was like, he said everything I was going to say. But I'm going to reframe it from the policymaker position. So you have to go back away from parking and the equity of parking to the equity of community. Okay, because it's just one part. Like if we make it all about parking, like we get car brain, right? Like, so you have to make it bigger. Like, so in our city, right, equity is like this much bigger conversation. So we have the highest minimum wage in the country. We provide predictable leave, paid leave, fair work week for every person who has an hourly wage job in our city. We have a recall rights to your job if you're laid off. Okay, we have tenant protections and just cause eviction ordinances. We have policies that prioritize housing at transit stops and along transit corridors. Okay, we have a $50 million affordable housing bond, so the city is an active market player in building housing for low-income people and strategically putting it in the places people want to live so they can make choices. And we eliminated parking minimums and reduced the maximums for affordable housing to a level that people come into affordable housing in our city and never need it. We have a free transit system. We're one of, I think, 4 or 5 in the United States. We have a fully free, paid for by every property owner in our city, pays into a PBID, property-based improvement district. And we have the Emery-Go-Round is a shuttle that runs 3 routes through our city and connects you to regional transit, including BART and regional rail. We have low-income childcare, one of 3 cities in California that runs its own childcare program. It's available to any employee or resident in the cities who wants to work there. So by doing all of those things, that's the holistic package. You can create a progressive, livable community, right? The conversation isn't then wrapped up in the need to have my car. 28% of our population doesn't need a car because we have given them all the other options available to them. You have to come back to something that we haven't said explicitly, but it's really clear and it has to be said. Parking and equity are at its core. There's lots of levels of equity. I'm not trying to take away from anything else here, but I will be really clear, is racial at its core. We can talk about gender, we can talk about ability, we can talk about sexual orientation, but we as a country continue to not address racial equity. And racial equity, if it was adequately addressed, would carry with it all the other components and marginalized and vulnerable groups that need to be lifted up. It would take all of them with them. At my transportation commission, I just was elected the chair, and this past week we had a retreat. And I was like, we have 3 action items this year. And the number 1 item is a racial equity action plan. So that every procurement, every contract, every hiring practice, the investments we make in transportation infrastructure is all done with a racial equity lens. We're going to do engagement with the community differently, right? Because if you actually embody those practices, then you actually get these types of results when it comes time to addressing the big like focused questions of like, how do you make parking more equitably accessible or price it the right way? You have already built those things into it so that there are options for people to go to when they need to make other choices. So it's got to be more comprehensive than like looking at this through a single lens of parking.
So I used to work for People for Bikes, and we took lots of study tours to the Netherlands and Copenhagen, to show elected officials and other city leaders really what a great bike infrastructure looked like and get them inspired and send them back home. They would always ask about equity. Like, how do you deal with equity? I mean, I'm using that as sort of a catchphrase. And they would be really unsatisfied by the answers that we got in Europe because they're absolutely not perfect in Europe. Like, there's a lot of racism. There's a lot of, not great stuff going on. But what I realize is that because they deal with income, with education, with housing on a more systemic level, at a higher level, the people figuring out bike lanes or congestion pricing or, these sort of things at the bottom end of the planning process, the outputs, weren't trying to fix a broken system at this very micro scale across every single little detail. So the staff were like, oh, we don't really deal with that. And so our delegations would be really offended, like that was a totally unsatisfying answer. And I finally realized they weren't just jerks. They're just dealing with it at a much, much higher level. And we're trying to Band-Aid this and contort all of these little things into fixing it because we're not all Emeryville. I mean, could you run for president and just deal with it? Okay, sorry, that was an aside for parking, but I wanted to validate what you were saying.
Thank you.
The next highlight followed a question about bicycle parking, and featured some disagreement amongst the panelists. You'll hear the question, then Tony, and then John.
I'm curious if you have thoughts on the kind of parking that we actually want to see more of. Bike parking, cargo bike parking, electric bike charging, and how that fits in with infill development, especially for older apartment buildings in the inner city that are not necessarily these new luxury developments with fancy bike rooms.
I have a hot take, which is I don't know if I like minimum bike parking requirements in new apartments, but I do think there was an old idea of like using district parking back, like I think 20 years ago. European cities would like collect money and build district parking instead for cars, and I think that's a great model we should do for bikes. We should have public staffed bike parking and even logistical drop-off centers for So I think we need more bike parking clearly, but I think more public than just cramped bike rooms.
Wait, you don't want minimum bike?
I was going to say, I'm going to make this a hot take in the opposite direction, which is yes. Thank you for the question, Jody. Ignore the council member to my right. Minimum bike parking on new developments, so one space per unit plus a certain number of guest spaces per number of units, right? Absolutely has to happen in an indoor locked facility in the building. We require that, by the way, so if you want to see that. We also are revising our design guidelines around that parking to make it more accessible to modern bicycling practices, which include e-bikes, which are hard to lift into vertical racks, which include bikes that have cargo bikes that have carriers, making sure we have space for people who have mobility limitations, who prefer trikes, right? So there's bike diversity that has to be accommodated. So it's not as simple as just being like, here's all the spaces that need to be filled. But I would also just add that in the public space, there is an obligation to put visible outdoor bike lockers, right? Because one of the biggest deterrents from people biking is they don't want to make an investment in something that will get stolen. And the truth is that one of the places where cars and bikes are different, even though your car can get broken into repeatedly, get in accidents, people feel differently about repairing because they made a larger investment. Whereas a bike gets stolen, people are like, I'm not going to bike again, right? And so you actually have to make bike storage publicly safe. And I think that that's a big investment that cities need to put in public places that people go, not just racks, but also lockers.
And finally, let's end with the short answers to a question in the Q&A session about how to proactively preempt negative responses to parking changes. You'll hear a shortened version of the question, then short answers from Tony and Leah, and then a point that Catie made elsewhere in the panel, but which seemed relevant here and was a good note to end on.
So I feel like a lot of the negative reaction to parking reform is literally reactionary. You propose something and then people come out of the woodwork because they realize it and they're upset. And so my question is how to proactively communicate and defuse people, because often it's hard to defuse people until after they get upset. And I want to avoid them getting upset in the first place. I guess, shout out, in Cambridge, Mass, we're trying this. They're not upset yet. We're not sure how to prepare. And shout out to our city councilor for making them not upset yet.
All right, one sentence answers.
Don't act like it's a problem to start with. I've seen a lot of planners go in acting apologetic, and I think that planners should go in acting like it's the right thing to do and not act scared.
I agree with that.
Also, use the parking revenue for things people want.
I'm going to add just a little message that I like to say. If you're circling looking for parking for 10 minutes, it is not your problem for being mad about that. That's the city's problem for not managing parking. If you're spending your time, which is valuable, looking, even if the spots are free, and if they're not free, like the city just took $2 and they provided you no service. That's inequitable. It should be a thing we should strive for, to say there's always an empty spot on the block. This is not a wild, unachievable dream. It's totally possible. So just make sure we're punching in the right direction.
You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.